Of awesomeness. Tony Dewan scale of awesomeness. My friend Tony Dewan, who builds a lot of cool stuff and who teaches web development sometimes, came up with a scale to measure the quality of a developer's work. He did this in the context of one of his classes to kind of give them an idea of how he might judge their homework and stuff. But it's also a pretty good way to gauge your progression as a developer throughout your career. And so he kind of thought, well, how do I judge my own work? And what goals do I set for myself when I'm writing code? And this is what he came up with, and I thought it was really good. So I like to share it with people. This is the scale, and that's Tony. First, does it work? Then, does it work well? Could it work better? In other words, can it be maintained? And then, could it work elsewhere? So starting from the beginning, does it work? Does it meet the functional requirements? Great. Tony tells his students, you'll probably pass. In the working world, you might not get fired. It works. But what do you think of someone who only does the bare minimum? We have higher standards for ourselves than that, don't we? Yes. Next on the scale, does it work well? Is the user experience acceptable? Behold the infamous Norman door, named after the inspiration of Don Norman's classic book, The Design of Everyday Things, originally titled The Psychology of Everyday Things. A door so bad, he had to almost invent a field of study. The door opens. It works, right? But the user experience is so darn bad that you have to print on the door how a door works. And guess what happens anyway? Everybody still pulls. Writing push on there doesn't help. Terrible user experience. Inexcusable. But it works. Person did their job. They made a thing that opens. So we don't stop with making things work, right? We need to make them work well. We need acceptable user experiences. If you do that, not only will you pass, you'll probably get a good grade. Outside the classroom, people may like you. Yes, even you. The folks in sales and marketing, maybe even customers, will sing your praises. You've made their lives so much easier. But you're not done yet. Other developers on your team may still hate you. There's still work to do. Does it work? Does it work well? Great. Could it be made to work better? In other words, can it be maintained? You read the code a lot more than you write it. Every line you write, you only write once in its final form. But then that gets read a zillion times if this is a thing that actually gets maintained over time. And depending on how you wrote that can determine whether this piece of code is even maintainable or not. If someone has to think really hard about what the thing does every time they look at it, then they're a lot more likely to introduce new bugs. So let's break down can it be maintained into a couple of other sub-items. Can anyone else read it? And anyone else could be you a month from now. Can everyone else read it? Great. So Tony says, not only will you pass, not only will you probably get a good grade, you'll probably get a job. If in the professional world, so we said you probably won't get fired. People may actually like you, and you'll probably get a raise if you can reach this level of proficiency. But I'll be frank, this poop's difficult. It can take longer to learn to write readable code than it takes you to learn how to code. It's kind of a lifelong journey, in fact. I've been doing this for an embarrassingly long time, and sometimes it's still a serious challenge to take my code from working and working well to being readable by others, including me. That makes it really tempting to get lazy and just ship your code once it works. Learn to resist that temptation, and your coworkers and future self will thank you. Seth and I are both big geeks about this thing. Aside from this one topic, we're the coolest dudes you know. But we kind of get really geeky about writing readable code. It's sort of fun. It's a fun challenge to write something that solves a complicated problem, but does it in a way that other people, including relatively inexperienced people, can make sense of. So sometimes even if we're working on separate projects, we'll just message each other, share our screen for a little bit, and say, okay, this does the thing, but how could I feel like there's a better way. How could we do it? And we'll just nerd out about that for a little bit, make it better, and then, hey, it goes better in the code review. You're young still, but have you ever written code, looked back at it a month later, and had no idea what you were thinking at the time? Yeah, you don't have to program for very long to encounter that situation. So seriously, by writing readable code, the developer you help may be you. So, does it work? Does it work well? Can it be maintained? And finally, could it work elsewhere? The last point on the scale. Could it be reused? So oftentimes the same solution can fit multiple problems with only minor variations. And the ability to write code in such a way that it can be used in multiple situations is indispensable. So in the first project, person stats, we had to build list items, right? And stick them somewhere. That was originally just in handle submit because that's when we needed to do that thing. So we wrote all that out. And we could have left it like that. But building list items out of some input is a pretty common problem. Might even need it more than one place in the same app. So we broke it out into its own function. And now on this app, we kind of need to do the same thing. And our new build list item or render list item function looks an awful lot like the old one. It's not identical, but we tweaked it just a tiny bit. So try not to tightly couple your code to the very, very specific problem you're trying to solve. Generalize it when you can. Oh, are you kidding me? So, taking it a step further, can it be packaged and shared? We often find ourselves using libraries that other people wrote, right? Like Foundation. Other people have solved some of these problems before. So we don't need to start from scratch necessarily. Well, maybe there are some exceptions, but for the most part, people don't build reusable libraries and frameworks and things just for kicks. They had to solve that problem themselves for some project, probably. And they just put in the extra effort to make it reusable. There's a story I'll tell you in a little more detail on the last day, probably, when we talk about our personal histories in excruciating detail. But one time about 10 years ago, a guy I was working with and I needed to solve a very specific problem for an app we were building. But he took just a little extra time and thought, well, this is a pretty common problem. I'm going to make this a reusable version of the same thing, and we'll just use this component that I built. So we did, and he threw it up on GitHub, and now 3 million people have downloaded it. So obviously, it was very helpful to other people that he just took, I don't know, it may have taken him an extra hour to turn that into something that could be reused. Now, of course, that's been maintained some over the years. But it wasn't that much harder to do it the first time. And then even at that same job, it wasn't the last time we needed to do that thing. But instead of copying and pasting the code and changing a couple of things, we just got to pull in this library that basically did all the work for us, except, we pass in some arguments that are very specific to the situation. But if you can identify the parts that are super specific and make those arguments or something, like we had build list item. So we had a label and a value in there. So that's the only thing that tied it to a person, right? We can make that a list of puppy dogs or movies or anything just by passing in a couple different arguments instead of rewriting the whole darn function. So if you can do that kind of stuff, you'll probably get a job. Maybe you'll get the best job. It's worth the extra effort. So the scale again. Does it work? Everybody knows that that's the goal, right? Make your code work. And you probably know, if you stop and think about it, it's better if it works well, if the user experience is acceptable, not just it checks off all the boxes, right? But then you're still not done. Write it in such a way that it can be maintained, that it can be read. And you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. And you'll save other people a lot of trouble. And your fellow developers may start to like you. Your other coworkers will like you just when you make stuff work well. But the other developers may even like you. And we're a surly bunch. Then, assuming you achieve that level of proficiency, can you write your code in such a way that it can be reused? Maybe even packaged and shared. So that's the scale of awesomeness. So think about that as you're writing code in here and everywhere, and try to hold yourself to those standards. Cool.